The screaming never stopped. Not after the guns went quiet. Not after the warp gate sealed. Not even after the Medici administered enough sedative to drop a grox. The screaming went on because it wasn't in the air anymore. It was in Trooper Ede Smyrn's skull, carved there by something that had looked through his eyes and decided to stay. I survived the siege of Calath Station. I survived 41 days in a trench system flooded with warp, light and daemon, touched promethium smoke. I survived the screaming that made my squadmates claw at their own ears until they bled. My name is Regimental Scribe David Toll, 2nd Platoon, 97th Veldrick Fusiliers, and this is my testimony of what the warp does to a man before it is finished killing him. I do not speak of plasma burns or bolt fire. I do not speak of the deaths that are clean enough to document on a standard form 881, gamma, cause of death combat related. I speak of the deaths that begin inside, the ones that start with a soldier who cannot stop counting ceiling tiles at midnight, the ones that end with a man who no longer recognizes his own hands. I was trained to record, to observe and transcribe with precision, to be the memory the regiment itself could not hold. I watched Ede Smyrn unravel thread by thread over 4 months, following our extraction from Calath Station, and I wrote down everything I saw. What follows is that record. If you are reading this testimony, then I have either found a way to smuggle it out of Schola Mortis IV, or I am already dead. I suspect the latter. Ede Smyrn came from Velda, same as the rest of us. He'd grown up in the agricultural hive settlements on the planet's equatorial belt, places where the sky was always yellow from chemical irrigation, mist, and children grew up understanding that the Emperor demanded labor, and the labor demanded silence. He was not the bravest soldier in 2nd Platoon, nor the quickest shot, but he was what veterans called steady. He kept his boots polished even when the mud made it pointless. He recited evening litanies without prompting. He called his last gun Auntie Brez, because it had belonged to his aunt before conscription, and he cleaned it every night the way a man tends something he loves. I liked Edis. That is not standard scribe notation, but this is testimony, not a field report, and the truth of what I witnessed requires me to say plainly that he was a good soldier and a decent man before Calath Station took something from him that never came back. We had been stationed at Calath Station for 6 weeks when the incursion began. The warp gate opened at the 3rd hour of the morning watch, a Tuesday by the Veldrick calendar, in the maintenance sub-level of the primary generatorum. By the time the alarm bell sounded, the first wave had already killed the entire watch shift. 43 men. Their bodies were not recovered. What was recovered, eventually, was something wearing their uniforms. I am not going to describe what the 41 days of siege were like in totality. That is not my purpose here. What I am going to describe is the light. The warp gate did not close when it should have. It blod. That is the only word I have found that fits. It blurred warp light into the maintenance corridors, and eventually into the lower trench networks, where 2nd Platoon held their section of the perimeter. The light was not a color. It was the suggestion of colors that did not exist, cycling through hues that made the eye slide away, and the stomach contract. Regimental Commissar Henrath ordered us to keep our visors down and our optic filters at maximum. He was right to do so. 14 soldiers in adjacent platoons who removed their visors for longer than a few seconds reported seeing things that did not depart when the light did. Adus kept his visor down for the full 41 days. He was disciplined that way. He followed orders with the earnestness of a man who had decided long ago that the structure of command was the thing standing between him and formless horror, and so he would honor it completely or not at all. When the warp gate finally sealed, the relief was physical. I felt the pressure in my sinuses release. Every soldier in the trench sagged simultaneously, as though someone had cut strings we hadn't known were holding us up. Ada sat down in the trench mud and laughed. It was a normal laugh. I want to be precise about that. It was relief, not hysteria. He laughed like a man who had survived something that deserved laughter, slapped his lasgun against his knee, and said, "Auntie Brez is filthy. She's going to take an hour to clean." That was the last thing he said that I was certain meant only what it appeared to mean. We were extracted 40 hours later, lighters to orbit, then a week's transit aboard the troop transport Faithful Contrition. then deployment to a recovery station on Mordane's Reach, a quiet agri world with nothing to recommend it except that nothing was trying to kill us there. Commissar Henrath called it convalescence. The medikis called it psychological stabilization. The soldiers called it not dying, which was accurate enough. Ada seemed fine during the transit. He cleaned Auntie Brez for the full hour he'd promised. He ate his rations. He slept, which was more than could be said for several members of the platoon who had taken mild warp exposure through compromised filters. Those soldiers were pulled from their bunks every few hours by night, terrors that left them rigid and white-eyed, gasping at the ceiling. Edda slept through their screaming without waking. I noted that in my initial field log, not because I found it alarming, but because it seemed like a mercy. I did not understand then that the thing I was watching was not sleep. Mordane's Reach smelled of turned earth and rain. Second platoon was billeted in a converted agri compound on the outskirts of the primary settlement, a long, low building with stone floors that stayed cool even in the afternoon heat. We were given rotation duties, light work to maintain structure without demanding too much from men still finding their footing. Edus was assigned to equipment inventory, cataloging and logging maintenance needs for the platoon's kit. He was good at it. Precise. Thorough. I was assigned to assist Medica Orderly Prash Veln, who was conducting the standard post-exposure wellness assessments. Not because I had medical training, but because I could write quickly and Veln's documentation needed to be clean enough to satisfy the Regimental Medicae Oversight Board at the quarterly review. I interviewed every soldier in the platoon, filling in Veln's assessments with their answers to a standardized list of questions: sleep quality, appetite changes, visual disturbances, auditory anomalies, intrusive thoughts, behavioral changes, difficulty concentrating, unusual beliefs. I interviewed Edus on a clear morning, 12 days after our arrival on Mordane's Reach. He sat in a wooden chair in the compound's small infirmary, his hands folded in his lap, patient and cooperative. The room smelled of antiseptic and the lavender oil the compound's previous owners had used to ward off insects. Outside, someone was running a maintenance cycle on a field tiller. The mechanical rhythm of it was almost peaceful. Sleep quality, I asked him. Fine, he said. Better here than on the transport. Appetite fine. He'd had seconds at evening mess 3 days running. Visual disturbances. He paused. Only a moment. No, he said. The pause was small enough that I almost wrote nothing and moved on. But I had developed, over years of recording testimony, a sensitivity to the particular quality of pauses that precede lies. Not dishonesty, necessarily. Sometimes people pause before saying no because they want to be sure. Sometimes they pause because they are not sure but are embarrassed to say so. Sometimes they pause because they are telling themselves a story about what the truth is in the hope that the story will convince them. I noted it as subject hesitated briefly before denying visual disturbances. Assess on follow-up. I moved to auditory anomalies. He said no without hesitation. Intrusive thoughts. He said no. Behavioral changes. He smiled, a small and slightly tired expression, and said, define behavioral changes. I read him the standard formulation. Significant deviations from baseline behavior patterns, as reported by self or observed by squad members. Nothing significant, he said. I've been sleeping more than usual. But we all need it. Unusual beliefs. I asked, and I watched him think about that question for a long time. What counts as unusual? He said finally. I told him the standard categories: beliefs not consistent with imperial doctrine, beliefs about reality inconsistent with documented facts, beliefs about the individual's own nature or significance. He looked at me, and there was something behind his expression I could not name. Not fear, not guilt. Something that looked, if I am being precise, like a man examining a door he knows leads somewhere he doesn't want to go but cannot stop himself from opening. No, he said. Nothing unusual. I filed the assessment as inconclusive, flagged for follow-up, and moved on to the next soldier. I want to be careful here to describe what I actually observed, and not what I later understood those observations to mean. Memory is a corrupted document. It gets edited by interpretation and by the need to construct narrative from chaos. I am trying to give you the raw record, not the story I told myself afterward. What I observed over the following 3 weeks. Edis began arriving to morning formation 7 minutes before the required time. This was not unusual. He had always been punctual. What was unusual was that he began counting aloud when he arrived, quietly, under his breath, numbers running from 1 upward. When I asked him about it during an informal check, he said he was counting the stones in the compound wall across the courtyard. He didn't know why. He said it felt better to know how many there were. He had counted them 4 times and gotten 4 different numbers, and so he kept counting to try to get a consistent answer. The wall had 217 stones, I told him. I had counted them myself out of curiosity. He looked at me with an expression that was almost pleading. That's the number I keep getting to, he said, but sometimes I lose count and have to start over, and then when I finish the number is different. That's the part that bothers me. I noted it. I attributed it to residual anxiety, which was common in the weeks following high-intensity warp exposure. The mind found small controllable things to fix on when large uncontrollable things had proven themselves lethal. He stopped cleaning Auntie Brez in the evenings. This was the detail that sat wrong in me, though I couldn't name why for several days. Edis had cleaned his lasgun every evening of his military service. I had never seen him skip it. He treated the weapon with a devotion that edged into the religious. And then, one evening 15 days into our Mordane's Reach billet, I came to write my nightly log and noticed that Auntie Brez was propped against his bunk footboard, uncleaned, while Edis lay on his back staring at the ceiling. "Edis," I said, "your lasgun." He looked at me, then he looked at the lasgun. Something crossed his face that I can only describe as recognition, but delayed, as though he was identifying a familiar object through fog. "Right," he said, and got up and cleaned it. But the next evening the same thing happened. And the evening after that. And on the 4th evening, when I pointed it out, he got up and cleaned it without speaking, and when he was done he sat on his bunk and looked at his hands for a very long time. "Deveth," he said, "do my hands look right to you?" I told him they looked like hands. "Right," he said, and went to sleep. I wrote possible dissociative episodes. Disrupted routine behaviors indicating intrusive cognitive interruption. Consider escalating to Medica Veln. I didn't escalate to Medica Veln. I told myself I would give it another week. I told myself he was improving in other ways, that his appetite was still good, that he was still performing his duties adequately. I was wrong to wait. I know that now. I will carry that wrong for whatever time remains to me. The nightmares began in the 3rd week. I know they began in the 3rd week, because that is when he started waking the others. Before that, if he dreamed badly, he did it silently. But on a night near the end of the 3rd week, Edis Mern came out of sleep with a sound that I have no accurate word for. It was not screaming. Screaming implies a human throat making a human sound. This was lower than screaming and more sustained, a sound like air escaping a punctured hull under pressure. 4 soldiers came out of their bunks before the sound stopped. Edis was sitting upright, eyes open, looking at something that was not in the room. He stopped when he saw us looking at him. His expression shifted through 3 or 4 states very quickly, and then settled on something like embarrassment. "Sorry," he said. "Bad dream." The embarrassment seemed real to me. I chose to believe it. I wrote in my log night disturbance, self-resolving, attributed to stress response. Corporal Cern, whose bunk was nearest to Ada's, came to me the next morning and told me quietly that she had heard the sound before. Not from Edis. From a soldier in her previous posting. A man named Reeve who had spent 3 days without his filter seal during a minor warp event, and had been taken to the Schola Mortis facility on the nearest Agri system 6 weeks later. She said Reeve had made that sound every night for 2 months before they came for him. She asked if I was watching Edis closely. I told her I was. I started watching more closely. The counting had spread. It was no longer just the courtyard wall. Edis counted his steps when he walked from the billet to the mess hall. He counted the number of times the roof leaked when it rained. He counted the stitches on Auntie Brez's carry strap, which I happened to know because I walked past him one afternoon and caught him at it, whispering numbers while his fingers moved over the fabric with the careful attention of a man reading sacred text. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was making sure nothing had changed since the last time he counted, Has anything changed? I asked. Not yet, he said. I did not ask what he was afraid might change. I wish I had. I want to explain something about the warp, to the extent that I, a scribe with no psychotraining and no access to Ordo Malleus archives, understand it. I write this not as doctrine, but as the conclusion I reached from observation, and I frame it as my own understanding rather than established fact, because the priests teach one thing, and the evidence I gathered pointed to another. The priests teach that the warp is the realm of chaos, of entropy and madness, of daemons, and the four powers of corruption. They teach that exposure to it corrupts the soul, and the flesh in dramatic and visible ways: mutation, possession, psychic manifestation. They teach that the signs of warp corruption are legion and unmistakable. What they do not teach, or do not teach to soldiers in agri-world regiments, is that the corruption is not always dramatic, that it can be slow and quiet and small, that it can take up residence not in the flesh, but in the architecture of thought, in the relationship between a man's mind and what he expects the world to be. The warp does not always remake its victims into monsters. Sometimes it simply adjusts the lens through which they perceive reality, incrementally, carefully, until they can no longer see what is real and what is memory, and what is the thing that followed them home from the gate. Adus Mern was not being possessed. He was being unmade from the inside, and the unmaking looked, for a long time, like nothing worse than anxiety. 4 weeks into Mordane's reach, I escalated to Medica Veln. I did it quietly, at the end of the morning's administrative period, presenting him with my collected notes rather than making it a formal report. I did not want Edus to feel surveilled. I did not want the intervention to feel like accusation. Veln read through my documentation twice, slowly, and then folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with an expression I recognized as the careful neutrality of a man thinking about how much honesty the situation required. The counting behavior, he said. How frequent? Constant when he's in open spaces. Less so when he's working with his hands. Night disturbances. 3 confirmed. And Corporal Cern believes there are more she's slept through. Dissociative episodes. I described the incidents with Auntie Brez, the long pauses before responding to simple questions, the moment with the hands. Veln was quiet for a moment. The infirmary smelled of the antiseptic he used on everything, sharp and clean in the back of the throat. Outside, someone was drilling a platoon on firing stances, and the count of the drill sergeant came in muffled through the window. Have you heard him speaking to anyone who isn't there? Veln asked. Not yet, I said. Veln closed my notebook and handed it back to me. We're going to conduct a level 2 assessment, he said. I want you to continue your observations. Document everything, date everything. Do not discuss with Edus that we're concerned. And Toll. He paused here, and his voice lost its clinical flatness for a moment, became something more human and more tired. Keep him away from his lasgun at night. I asked why. Because if this progresses the way I'm afraid it might, he said. We don't want him having access to it during the episodes. I understood what he was not saying. I took the lasgun from its place at Edus's bunkside that evening while he was at mess. I told him the armorer wanted to check the charge cycle. He accepted this without question, which told me something I hadn't wanted to know about how present he actually was. The Level 2 assessment happened in the 2nd week of the following month. Medica Veln conducted it himself, which was unusual. Normally the Orderlies handled routine assessments and Veln only sat in for the flagged cases. Edus knew this. He was observant enough and present enough to notice the deviation. When they were finished, Edus came to find me. I was in the administrative office adjacent to the infirmary, entering the previous week's supply requests into the regimental ledger. Edus sat down in the chair across from my desk and looked at me with an expression I cannot cleanly describe even now. It was not accusatory. It was not frightened. It was the expression of a man who has been looking at something from one angle for a long time and has just stepped to the side and seen it from another. You told him, he said. Yes, I said. I was concerned. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon wind moved through the compound's trees, a sound like a slow exhale. The things I've been seeing, he said. Are they real? I asked him what things. He thought about whether to tell me. I watched him think about it, watched the calculus move behind his eyes, and then he decided something. In the corners of rooms, he said. Not quite there. Like peripheral vision, but when I turn to look it moves. And at night when I can't sleep. There are shapes. I know they're not there. I know it. But knowing doesn't make them stop. How long, I ask? Since the transit, he said. Since the faithful contrition. He had been telling himself they would stop. He had been waiting for them to stop the way you wait for a fever to break. He had not wanted to believe they were something that wouldn't stop on their own. Are they getting worse? I asked him. He looked at me, and in his eyes was something I had not seen there before. The particular clarity that comes when a person has decided to stop lying to themselves. Yes, he said. The shapes had names now. He told me this during one of our informal check-ins in the 5th week. In the compound courtyard in the early afternoon, when the sun was high enough that the shadows were short and hard-edged, and there were fewer places for the peripheral things to live. He had not named them intentionally. They had arrived named. The way sounds in the dark arrived with meaning already attached. The tall one he called the architect. He said it was taller than the ceiling of the billet, and should not have fit in the room, but occupied it anyway, standing in the corner nearest his bunk, watching. The word watching was his. I asked how he knew it was watching. He said, because it always knew when he was looking at it. If he turned suddenly, it was not where it had been. If he looked at the corner directly, it was not there at all. But in the moment between sleep and waking, when his eyes were open but his guard was down, he could see it clearly, and it was looking at him. The others he described as smaller, more numerous. They moved along the baseboards. They were interested in different things than the architect, the equipment, the floor, the spaces under bunks. He said they seemed like assessors, like they were cataloguing. I asked if they communicated with him. He shook his head, slowly, and there was something in the shake that told me the question had touched something he wasn't ready to say. Not in words, he said. I wrote it down. Every word. His hands were folded on his knees as he spoke, very still, the studied stillness of a man exercising deliberate control over a body that wants to do something else. I noted that his hands were shaking. Medicae Veln filed the formal notification to regimental command in the 6th week. I saw the document afterward. He wrote it carefully, in the particular language that the oversight systems respond to without triggering panic, elevated stress response, warp exposure, related anxiety syndrome, requiring specialist assessment, recommend transfer to appropriate facility. The words that were not in the document, what I had observed, what I had heard, what Corporal Cern had reported to me informally over the weeks since the nightmares began. I asked Veln if he was going to tell Edis what the transfer meant. I'm going to tell him he's being referred to a specialist, Veln said. He'll understand the rest. We both knew what the rest was. There is a facility on a moon near Mordane's Reach called Schola Mortis IV. Its official designation is Warp, Exposure Rehabilitation and Monitoring Station. Soldiers sent there sometimes came back. More often they didn't. The ones who came back were different. Not worse, necessarily, but different in the way that a repaired thing is different from the original. The ones who didn't come back were documented as lost to complications. I asked Veln if he was certain. He looked at me for a long moment, and his expression had the exhausted quality I had come to associate with people who were making decisions they had made many times before. He described them to you, he said. The architect, the assessors. He paused. Toll, he knows their names. Not names he gave them, names that arrived. Do you understand the distinction? I said I did. Then you know why, he said, and he was right, and I hated him for being right. I told Edis myself. I felt I owed him that. I found him in the equipment bay in the late afternoon, doing inventory on the squad's kit with the same methodical precision that had always characterized his work. The bay smelled of oil and metal. The light was yellow and warm. He was working his way down a row of charge packs, checking each one against his list, and when I came in he looked up and saw my face and was quiet. When, he said. 3 days, I told him. A transport was coming from Schola Mortis IV. He set down the charge pack he was holding. Carefully, he picked it up again and set it down again, which I think he did because his hands needed to be doing something. "What happens there?" he said. It was not quite a question. I told him what I knew, which was limited and imprecise. Assessment. Treatment. Monitoring. I told him the medica believed the interventions could help. "But I might not come back," he said. I didn't answer. He didn't need me to. He was quiet for a long time. The equipment bay held the sound in a way that outdoor spaces didn't, something about the metal walls, and the quiet had a texture to it. He picked up the charge pack a third time and set it down. "The architect showed me something," he said. "Last night. I did not want to hear this. I made myself ask. It showed me the gate," he said. "Kalath Station. Not the way I remember it. The way it actually was. From inside." I asked what that meant. "There was something on the other side," he said, looking through. "It wasn't trying to get in." He paused. "It was looking at all of us. Counting. The way I count the stones in the wall. Just trying to get a consistent number." The silence stretched between us. Through the bay's small window, I could see the courtyard, and the wall with 217 stones, and the late afternoon light on it, and the shadow of the compound building reaching toward it. "Daveth," he said, "do you think what I see is real?" I said I didn't know. "That's the only honest answer," he said, and there was something like gratitude in his voice. He cleaned Auntie Brez that night for the first time in 3 weeks. I watched him do it from across the billet, without making it obvious I was watching. He was thorough and careful. The same ritual he'd performed 1,000 times, his hands knowing the sequence, without direction from his conscious mind. When he was done, he held the lasgun in both hands, and looked at it for a long moment, and then he spoke to it, quietly, in a tone I associated with someone concluding a conversation. He said, "I don't think you're going to Schola Mortis, old girl. But I want you to know I tried." He put Auntie Brez down, lay back on his bunk, and stared at the ceiling. I filed my last observation log for the night's subject demonstrating apparent acceptance. Behavioral stabilization in advance of transfer. Monitor for deviation. I slept 3 hours. The rest of the night I lay awake thinking about what it meant that the warp thing had been counting. The transport arrived 2 days later rather than 3, which I believe was deliberate. The individuals who came off it were not from any medical detachment I recognized. They wore Schola Mortis uniforms, which were a pale grey that I had been told was chosen to be calming, and they moved through the compound with the practiced efficiency of people who did not want transfers to have time to think. Edis was in the equipment bay when they arrived. He had been working every available hour, I think, because work kept the peripheral things at bay, kept the space inside his skull occupied with numbers and lists, and the satisfying certainty of items accounted for. When I came to tell him the transport was here, he put down his data, slate and washed his hands at the bay sink, and dried them on a cloth with methodical care. He had packed already. Everything was neat, a soldier's pack, nothing wasted. Corporal Cern was in the courtyard when we came out. She stood at attention and held it until Edis passed, which was the soldier's acknowledgement for a squad mate going somewhere they might not come back from. He nodded to her. His face was controlled in the way that faces are controlled when the alternative is not bearable. At the gate, he stopped and turned to me. "I counted them again," he said. "The stones. This morning." "How many?" I asked. 217, he said. "Same as always." He seemed to find that satisfying, as though the consistency of a small thing was proof of something he needed proved. "That's good," I said. "Yes," he said. "It is." He picked up his pack and walked to the transport without looking back. The grey uniformed attendants fell in behind him. The ramp closed. The lighter rose on its landing thrusters, disturbing the courtyard dust, and was gone into the yellow sky. I stood in the courtyard for a long time. Then I went and counted the stones in the wall. I wanted to make sure. 217. The same. I am not sure why it mattered to me. But it did. I requested access to his post-transfer assessment records through official channels 8 months later. The request was denied on grounds of patient confidentiality and ongoing treatment sensitivity. I filed an appeal through the Regimental Administrative Oversight Board. The appeal was denied with the additional notation that records pertaining to Schola Mortis IV patients were restricted under Ordo Secana review protocols. I filed a second appeal. I am not certain it was received. What I know from unofficial sources, which I will not identify because I will not get them killed, is that Edis arrived at Schola Mortis IV functional and oriented, that he cooperated with the initial assessments, that the assessments confirmed what Medicae Veln had suspected, that his exposure to the warp, light during the Calith station, siege had done something to the way his perceptual architecture processed reality. Not the spectacular way. Not possession, not mutation, not psychic manifestation, the quiet way, the adjustment of the lens. What I know is that he was placed in an observation ward and held there for several months. I know that the treatment available for what he had was limited, because the damage was not to the body, but to something less mappable. I know that at some point, during those months, he stopped cooperating with assessments. I know that he was reclassified, from patient to subject. I know that reclassification, in the context of Schola Mortis IV, has a specific and undocumented meaning. I know that there is a Form 881, gamma filed in the regimental records, listing Edis, Mern as lost to warp exposure complications, and that the date on the form is 6 months after his transfer, and that I am a scribe who has processed hundreds of such forms and knows what the language means, when the language is not saying what actually happened. I have tried to be precise in this testimony. I have tried not to let what I know at the end color what I describe of the beginning. But I am also aware that precision has limits, and that there are things I observed which I cannot account for within the limits of what I was trained to record. On the night after Edis left for Schola Mortis IV, I woke at the 2nd hour past midnight from a dream I cannot remember. I lay awake in the dark for a moment, and I became aware that I was looking at the corner of the room nearest my bunk. There was nothing in the corner. I am certain of this, but I looked for a very long time before I was certain. And in the morning, I went to the courtyard and I counted the wall stones again. And again they numbered 217, and I could not have told you whether I counted them, because I expected the number to be wrong, or because I needed proof that it was still right. That is the question I have carried since Calith Station, not whether what Edis saw was real, whether the fact that I look for it now means something happened to me too, something smaller, something not yet loud enough to be a name, something turning slowly in the place behind my eyes, where my certainty about the world used to live. The warp does not always take what it wants all at once. Sometimes it is patient. I am writing this by oil lamp in a storeroom on my 3rd unauthorized posting since leaving the 97th Veldrick Fusiliers. I will not specify the location. I have been moving since I submitted the formal inquiry that I should not have submitted. The response to that inquiry confirmed my suspicion that asking the wrong questions in writing is a faster way to disappear than having warp exposure on your record. A formal inquiry into Schola Mortis IV patient reclassification protocols tends to attract a particular kind of attention, the sort that wears grey uniforms and does not knock. I do not know if Edis Mern is alive. I do not know if the thing they reclassified him into constitutes living, in any sense that would have mattered to the man who called his lasgun Auntie Brez and counted the stones in a wall 4 times, because the count kept changing. I know that whatever is left of him, if anything remains, cannot count the wall anymore, cannot feel the familiar weight of a lasgun he inherited from someone he loved, cannot watch the morning form up with the sun still low and breathe the relief of having made it through another night. I know that the warp did not turn him into something monstrous. It did something quieter and, I think, more honest about what it was. It reached into the architecture of his mind and moved things, incrementally, carefully, until the map no longer matched the territory, until the numbers stopped adding up, until the shapes in the corners had names he hadn't given them. And then it waited to see what we would do about it. We sent him to Schola Mortis IV, and Schola Mortis IV did the rest. If you are reading this testimony, whoever you are, wherever you found it, look at the corners of the room you are in. Look at them directly, not from the edge of your vision. If there is nothing there, count your stones. Keep counting until the number is consistent. Check again tomorrow. Not because you should be afraid. Because the thing that concerns me is not what is in the corner. It is how long it takes you to decide to look. Filed testimony of Regimental Scribe Deveth Toll, formerly of the 97th Veldrick Fusiliers, compiled over 14 months following the siege of Calath Station. Current disposition of witness unknown. Date of compilation. Cross-reference Form 881 Gamma Mern Edus, Regimental Number 97 VF2LT447. Cross-reference Schola Mortis IV intake record. This document is not authorized for distribution. If found, submit to the nearest Administratum Records Office for secure disposal. Do not read it twice.